I know that we've both done a lot of podcasting. I've had the pleasure of coming on your show. You've done hundreds of podcast episodes, as have I. One of the things I would love to ask you as we start is if we were to make one of the absolute best podcast episodes that you ever created, what do you think we would have to do today to pull that off?
I think the chemistry has to be there. I think if you and I get into a groove and we're really having an enjoyable conversation, that's where the magic lies. So it won't be any specific item that's said. It'll be more about how it's said and how our conversation flows. And if we get to where we have that chemistry and it's a really enjoyable conversation, we're vibing, that's where it's going to be the best.
Speaking of that, you have a podcast with multiple hosts, and that's something that I've certainly seen before, but I feel is a little bit unique. A lot of people think about starting a solo show where it's a little bit scripted, or they might think about just interviewing one-on-one like this style. I do a combination of those two, but I've never done the multiple host thing. Could you take me back to the journey of starting your show, the Present Fathers Podcast?
Yeah. So all four of us were friends for a very long time. We all have children, and we were constantly texting, calling, doing video chats, talking about fatherhood, talking about relationships, all of these things. And I noticed that all of us became better when we had these conversations. Whenever we do a check-in, we try to do a monthly check-in and say, how's everyone doing? We do a little bit of housekeeping, business, how's the podcast doing, all that kind of stuff. But it's mostly checking in on each other. A lot of us have very young children, and the stress is very high, and we need that brotherhood and that engagement with each other. So it all started when we said, hey, you know what? We're having these conversations all the time. They're really valuable for us. Let's record some of them and have some fun with it. And we had about 10 episodes where it was just the four of us chatting. We had it set every 2 weeks. We all looked forward to it. We'd be sending each other articles and interesting things, and a little bit of healthy competition. We try to one up each other and say, oh, here's my idea. It's better than yours. All that kind of stuff. There's a lot of rivalry, a lot of fun challenges and stuff like that. So we had so much fun with it. It got a lot of traction. We got a lot of good feedback. And one day I mentioned that a personal hero of mine is a psychologist who wrote a book called His Needs, Her Needs, and how neat it would be to actually talk with him. But, he's in his 80s, he's retired, he'd never talk to us. So my co-host Brandon emails him and says, hey, we'd love to chat with you. Sure enough, he's available. We interview him a month later. It was magic. He's an incredible speaker, really cool experience. So we decided to continue having guests. And so from that point on, the majority of our episodes include guests, and it adds a really unique and interesting element. What I love about the group is that there's a little bit less pressure on each of us as speakers. So when we do have the chance to speak, we're really excited about it, and we have really great points that we get to make. There's a whole back channel of chatting where we're trying to crack each other up. That's one of the best parts of the show is if I'm trying to make a really serious point and Justin in the private chat makes a joke that makes me laugh during that serious point, we all crack up. That's a big win, right? For him, he's able to get me to do that. So it's kind of that classic. There's the two guys, right, who tell each other bad jokes and they try not to laugh. And so it's, kind of one of those scenarios. So that's how it all kind of got together. We all have great chemistry. We all bring a lot of different things. We're completely different personalities. We're all very different kinds of dads. We have some core agreements that we have that are really important, but as far as how we approach life, what we think is most important with being a dad, it's all so very different. And so we've all really become stronger together, and that's what makes it so fun. We're all specialties in different areas too. I'm big on Twitter, and George is our YouTube guy. Brandon's all over LinkedIn, and Justin's our Instagram guy. So, between the four of us, we kind of have all the bases covered of your socials. Whereas if it was just me trying to do that, there'd be no way, right? I might be able to cover one social media by myself, but you couldn't possibly get that kind of range. So having that team element to it has really been special.
Is something that I could say I'm jealous of in some ways because but the grass is always greener, and there are certainly elements that make it easier about not having a team. But as someone who's like a former athlete, and then I became a civilian, as I like to say, it's been a big change to like being this sort of like solopreneur, entrepreneurial content creator, etc. So the team aspect is definitely amazing. When I had the opportunity to join you on the show, it was a lot of fun. And even in just one episode, I'm sure many of your guests would say a similar thing. I felt like I was a part of that team. You guys were very welcoming. The communication was effective, and there was still like a camaraderie and chemistry, as you put it, to creating together. So it was a lot of fun. I'm sure there are challenges. What are some of those challenges in terms of if someone's thinking of starting a show with others that they should keep in mind how to overcome?
There are so many challenges with having a group. Scheduling is a nightmare, right? It's tough enough to get a guest and yourself, I'm sure, to line up schedules that work. Now try to bring together 5 different people that all want to do the episodes. Initially, we really tried very hard to only do an episode if all 4 of us were available. We said that was really important. We're all a cohesive unit. We have to do that. What we realized is that as the show has expanded and we've gone off in different directions, George is doing a coaching business. He's partnered with a man named Nick Lavery, who has an incredible story. He's one of the only Green Berets in history to go back to active duty after losing a leg. So he gets shot, loses the leg, puts a tourniquet on himself. He basically saves his own life, gets sent to Walter Reed Hospital, one of the top hospitals in America. And 40 surgeries later, Michelle Obama, President Barack Obama's wife, goes and meets him and says, "Hey, you're a real hero. Is there anything I can do to say thank you?" And he said, "Talk to your husband. Get me back in there. I still have more to give back to this country." She's crying. The family's crying. Big moment. Anyway, so she does just that. And the reason he's back fighting, and he's still active duty today, he's currently in the U.S. Armed Forces, is because he had a special dispensation from President Obama to get it done. So quite a guy. And George is super excited. They're doing a program. It's called The Forge together. And so they do coaching and all that kind of stuff. So that's his side, right? He's got that big military background. And he's a very direct, very blunt person, which I love. I tease him and I say he's my most toxic friend because he'll just say whatever he's thinking. And sometimes we need that as men, right? We don't need to, we don't need a hug. We need a little punch in the shoulder. And he's that guy to give that to you. That can be challenging when I'm in kind of a bad mood and he says, "Hey, you're not doing a good enough job. Do better." That's a personality challenge. Whereas I tend to be the opposite. I'm not honest enough. I'll just say, "Oh, you're doing great. Don't worry about it," when what someone really needs is just to be told the truth. And I grew up thinking that it was always better to be as kind as possible and to gloss over the truth if it meant that it wouldn't hurt someone's feelings. And as I've gotten older, I've learned that that's a very unhealthy thing. And in fact, one of the worst things you can do to someone who needs the truth is to lie to them to be nice or to avoid conflict. And so that's one of those interesting challenges, right? These different personalities that we have where I will sometimes not be as honest as I should with my wife, with other family members, especially with the guys. And then they're more direct and kind of able to give me kind of what I need. And so that's, anytime there's 4 people working together, there's always going to be challenges with different kinds of personalities. Over the past couple of years that we've done the podcast, we haven't had any major fights. There haven't really been any big breakdowns like, "Oh, you're the worst," kind of thing. It almost, it might be better for ratings and all that if we had that, right? If we got on there and all of a sudden we're just fighting, right? But we don't really have that kind of relationship. We all get along pretty well and we have, pretty healthy ways of dealing with conflict. But maybe as a joke, we should do one episode where we just go full drama, and just yell at each other. Yeah. I don't know how healthy that would be, but it'd be pretty funny, to have that experience.
And it's the clips from that will maybe go viral. The whole idea of feeding into these algorithms when it's 4 people. So it makes me think of things like Ninja Turtles and boy bands, things that in any great story go well for a while. And then maybe, things change a little bit, things evolve. In terms of a little bit of behind the scenes where maybe you need to throw up like a disclaimer, but I know a lot of people will be curious about thinking back to high school or college, even grade school, when you had to do like group projects and someone pulls more weight than another. Was this something that was started out with the intention that it would be like 25, 25, 25? And is that the hope to keep it that way in terms of who takes ownership of this thing?
That was definitely the goal initially. So our idea was we each had as I mentioned, our specialty that we focus on in social media. And what has happened is that George has done most of the edits. He's kind of got the background for that. And so I think he's definitely done more than his 25%. So that has been a little bit of a source of stress. We've done our best to take as much off of his plate as he can. But ultimately, it's not always 25-25. Now, just as in a relationship, right? So with my wife, I know that, what is it, the 80-20 rule, where I know that sometimes I have to give 80% and she only has 20% to give. And other times she's giving 80 and I'm giving 20. And that's okay as long as it doesn't last, for years on end. And so whether it's a marriage or whether it's a partnership like it is with us, we definitely recognize that there are times, if I have a week on vacation, I have more time to spend on edits and to give as much as I can, to the podcast during that period. But then if I'm on call at the hospital and I'm working 24/7, there's not much I can do. I can't help, during that period. So our goal is to not necessarily always be 25-25, but to ensure that over the course of a year, it averages out to that. And that's worked out pretty well. We also recognize Justin, for example, is in the thick of it with a 3-year-old and a 6-month-old. So 2 basically in diapers. He's very busy with work. His wife is a pediatric dentist. She works. So he has a little bit more on his plate than some of the others of us do. So we recognize that and say, okay, if he's not able to contribute quite as much, that's okay. We try to have realistic expectations in that regard. So, and it's the same with our relationships with our wives and our children, right? If we have unrealistic expectations, my wife needs to have sex with me 3 times a day, every day, always, no matter how she's feeling, you're going to be really unhappy, right? There's not a lot of people who, that's realistic for. And those kinds of expectations can really set you up for failure. So it's the same, with our podcast. We try not to have unhealthy expectations of each other. And then we're surprised and delighted when we do come out and say, hey, we were able to do this cool thing. I got this amazing guest. You won't believe it. Justin Nolan agreed to talk to us on our podcast. We are so excited. This is going to be an amazing conversation. Let's do our best job to make sure that we give him the best experience that we can. So yeah, great question. It definitely could be a source of stress, but I think we've done a nice job of heading that off at the pass and recognizing that it won't always be an equal partnership every single day.
Maybe someone in the top 1% of the world would be appreciative of the sex 3 times a day, but I get where you're going with that.
Oh, I'd be exhausted. No, I don't want that either.
Yeah, I'm not in the top 1% in that regard. So one of my favorite lines that I remember, I'll never forget from the book, The One Thing, was the idea that balance is a myth. And that the reality for all of us is that we need counterbalance. And that's kind of what you're alluding to when it comes to this shifting of 80-20, maybe sometimes it's 60-40, but having to change where our balance goes. With good communication, we can do those kinds of things. It reminds me also of creating in seasons. Like sometimes I'll stress out about my own goals and how I'm not making enough progress, maybe writing, but in this current season, my daughter really needs me because she's been sick. And so that's where some of the focus is going, and being okay with setting that aside, because that balance will swing back where sometime soon I'm going to be able to write 30 hours a week and I'll be excited for that. So I definitely appreciate when it comes to, monetization, to use an annoying kind of buzzword. But long-term with the podcast, again, I think people who are listening to this and thinking of starting a show, if they're thinking of starting it with others, that is another point that could be stressful. But from what I understand, you all have jobs as well, which maybe relieves a bit of that stress. I don't want to guess too much, but I'm curious. We kind of talked about the workflow and the workload and the initial ownership over who does what. As far as the possible results or success of the show, is it a situation where you're just hoping to reinvest in spreading the message for a very long period of time? Or would there be a goal of being able to take this more full-time? And how does that sort of success get split up?
Okay, great question. And we spoke about this recently. George, again, with his coaching program, I think in his ideal world, he could take that full-time. He'd be a full-time relationship coach, and that could be very lucrative for him. Maybe be a speaker. There's a lot of other interesting ways that a podcast, you don't necessarily need YouTube paying you for ads to be a successful podcaster from a financial standpoint. So I think that would be his goal. Having gone through anesthesia school and all that, I don't have any interest in quitting medicine. Even if I had the opportunity to make $10 million full-time as a podcaster, I genuinely believe that I'd rather be doing medicine. I recently have had the opportunity to become a professor of anesthesia as well. So now 1 day a week, I'm teaching fellow master's level students all the basics of anesthesia. And it is an absolute joy. It's such a different way to use your brain and experience. And as much as the podcasting as I've been doing, I was terrified when I got up on stage in front of those 30 kids and started teaching them about anesthesia machines. It was so different, than what I'm used to. So I've really grown from that. It's been very enjoyable. So from a monetization standpoint, I would prefer to see the payments commensurate with the amount of work. So if we find over the next year that I'm more focused on anesthesia and Justin is more focused on his work and his kids, and Brandon is doing his writing, and then George is shouldering 50% of the load for the entire podcast, I would want him to be remunerated commensurately for that. I think that's only fair. And so our current financial plan is that any money that comes in, I'm getting paid from Twitter. George is getting the money from YouTube. Any of that money goes into a pot, and then we reinvest it in the podcast. We've met a couple of editors that are doing incredible work. David Carbutt does all of the editing for Farzad's podcast, and it looks better than NBC News. I mean, the quality on it is unbelievable. So we've taken some of that money, invested it back into editing, and the videos have just been so much fun to make. I mean, it's like having access to a Ferrari all of a sudden when you're used to driving it's an incredible feeling. So that's the idea right now, is that we reinvest any money that we make back into helping the podcast grow. Green screens, microphones, all that kind of stuff. That's all come from the podcast revenues. So if that changes at some point to where we do have more money coming in and it's more than the cost of actually doing all the podcast editing and all that, then we would look at changing the structure. But currently it's all about reinvesting back into the podcast. It's a lot like a startup, right? Where you get your initial seed investment, Series A, Series B, all of that. And there's no money that's going out to anyone's bank accounts. It's all getting put back into the business. And that's the phase that we're in right now.
Which is a fun phase to be in. And I feel like that's just a really good lesson for people who maybe don't have any experience with entrepreneurship, creating a startup, or building a podcast, stuff like that, that they wouldn't necessarily think of reinvesting for an indefinite, maybe arguably a long period of time. The longer you can reinvest, I think, I'm a big believer that the better it will be long-term if you can continue to do that. So I think that's really helpful for a lot of people. You mentioned being on call at the hospital, being in medicine and anesthesiology, and then being a teacher of it. It would be interesting to talk about how you got into that career, because a lot of people that listen to the show are thinking of making a career pivot or sort of looking at those prerequisites that they might need out of high school to go into college, stuck in that, what the heck am I going to do with my life mode? We've never had anyone on the show with the background that you have in medicine, and it'd be cool to talk about that as a topic, because I think it's a really neat one. So how did you get into it? And actually, the curse of knowledge plays a big role on this show a lot. So let's just start off with, what the heck is anesthesiology?
This is one of my favorite topics to talk about. I was given the opportunity by Kaplan and George Washington University last year to talk to a bunch of high school students about the profession, how to get into it, benefits, disadvantages, all that. And it was such a joy to kind of give people that background. So I was a personal trainer when I graduated from college for about 10 years. I taught tennis, yoga, absolute joy. I had clients for over 10 years who had wonderful results. I developed long-term friendships. And one of my clients is an anesthesiologist in Georgia. Wonderful human being, will always be a mentor and someone that I'll look up to. And he told me that I would enjoy doing medicine more than I was doing personal training, and that it's something that I should look at doing long term. And so he got me in to do some shadowing. So the first step, whether you're 18 or 40, is to get yourself into a hospital and shadow someone who's in anesthesia, because you may hate it. You might not like the sterile environment. You might find the mask uncomfortable. You might hate the sight of blood. There's a lot of things that people might not like about anesthesia. The things that I love are the challenge. You always have students with you, so you're always teaching. I'm always looking out for my patients. We're kind of like the watchers in the night, right? Your surgeon is there to fix the patient, but we're there to make sure that nothing bad happens to the patient while that happens, right? They're asleep, they're comfortable, they survive the surgery. It's very satisfying because even if that patient isn't fixed long-term, which is tough for the surgeon, right? Maybe they have to bring them back. I've kept them safe. And so my job is complete. And that feels wonderful to know that I was able to take someone often during one of the more difficult parts of their life, right? Preparing for a big surgery might be the worst feeling that someone ever has as far as anxiety. And so I'm the person who helps relieve their fear and keep them safe and make sure that they do well for that. That's an incredible feeling for me. I can't think of anything more satisfying than knowing that I was protecting someone at their most vulnerable. So absolutely love that about anesthesia. As far as what it is, we keep people safe and keep people comfortable during surgeries. So that could be having babies, right? We place the epidurals and make sure that the mom is nice and comfortable while she delivers the baby. We do open heart surgeries. Those are fascinating. I did that for 3 years. We completely stop the heart. We use potassium, and you get to watch the heart as it goes from ba-dum to slowly stopped. And now the surgeon is able to work on the heart while we keep them asleep. They wake up and their heart is fixed. It's magic, right? I mean, what we do, I've been doing this for 10 years and I still watch it and it's magic. It's really incredible what we're able to do for people. So really, really enjoy that. Now, I'm not a doctor. I have a master's of anesthesia. So one of the cool things, and I don't know what the Canadian option is. I apologize. This is only for people in the United States. I went to college, so I have my 4-year degree. I had physics, chemistry, all of those prerequisites. If you like, in the show notes, I can send you a list of the college prerequisites that someone would need to be able to apply for a master's of anesthesia, which is what I do. About 80% of mid-level anesthesia providers, which is what I am, right? Your doctor is your top level, your physician anesthesiologist, and then your mid-level is what we are. We do most everything that a doctor can do just under their supervision. So I'm not allowed to practice on my own. So if you are the kind of person who hates taking orders and just absolutely needs to know I'm the one doing it, this is not the job for you. When a doctor disagrees with me, if I have one idea, he has another, I do what she says, right? That's just part of the job. And that's okay. They have more training than we do. I'm usually okay with that. So get your 4-year undergraduate degree. And then it is a 2.5-year master's program. There are now about 25 schools in the United States that offer this program. So it's still a relatively small program. There's only about 4,000 of us. I think of it as a hidden gem. Most people really don't know about it. We can only work in about 25 states. So not every state in America has work available for anesthesiologist assistants, which is what I do. So keep that in mind as well. If you want to work in California, we'll get there eventually, but we're not there yet. There's a little bit of mostly friendly competition between anesthesiologists and nurse anesthetists. And so because of that, nurse anesthetists can work in all 50 states. AAs, anesthesiologist assistants, which is what I am, can only work in about 25 states. So that's, kind of one of the differences there. But let's say you live in Florida, like I do, and you want to practice in Florida, like I do. I work for the Cleveland Clinic, and they have satellite offices in Dubai, Vero Beach, which is where I work, all over Florida, Cleveland, obviously. They're kind of all over the place. So that's where I work. So if you live in Florida or Georgia or one of the states that it's available, and you do your 2.5-year master's program, we do about 3,000 hours of clinical practice. So it's about a year of didactic work where you're just in the classroom learning everything about anesthesia, about how the machine works, about how chemistry works. All these different things are part of the training. And then the majority of the program, you are working directly one-on-one, either with a doctor or an anesthesiologist assistant who is teaching you how to do stuff. It's a lot of hands-on work. They're helping you through the process as we place breathing tubes, as we give medications, as we do all the things involved with anesthesia. So if anyone watching this has any questions, feel free to contact me. I'm happy to walk you through the steps. But first things first, go into the hospital, go shadow, go see what it's like, because it is really different than your regular life, most likely. Being in an operating theater is really special, unique, and awesome, but it can be a little bit intimidating. And so going in and shadowing and taking some of that mystery out of it and seeing how it works is a really key element of that. So I hope I didn't talk your ear off about that, but that's where I'm at.
It's okay. You did not. And I expect that people, when they're really passionate about a subject, would nerd out about what they're talking on, of course. And like,
Yeah.
we're only kind of getting started, I think, because I have a few follow-up questions. One connection first, though, I feel like the ability to shadow in any workplace is a really powerful transferable skill and an extremely underrated skill. Of course, with something like being a pilot or being an anesthesiologist, or in my case, I grew up working in a funeral home. And there's a lot of people who say that they want to work in a funeral home as well. It's like, you ever been in one? And they're like, nope. And it's like, you might want to go look first before you sign up for like a 2-year degree. Not because it's a bad idea, but there are so many possible things that you may not like about it, or that you may need to identify you need to overcome before liking stuff about it. And so I think that point that you made about going and doing some background work that's early on and like pretty low cost, high reward, if you find out that it's not for you, some sort of job shadowing thing, is applicable to, pretty much every industry, I guess. When I think about anesthesiology, it reminds me a little bit of my fear of flying, like in airplanes. And I have a friend I play hockey with who is a pilot, and is obviously, he flies for Air Canada, so he's flying all over the world all the time. And I'm always asking him like these passive anxiety patient type questions of just trying to make sure that he continues to tell me things that makes it such that when I go to get on my next flight, it's going to be a lot easier because he's so damn comfortable with it. Anesthesiology, in the sense of like being put to sleep as a patient, is something that I know gives people a lot of anxiety. You mentioned it a little bit. What is the reality? Like how a pilot would say, oh, well, I'm not scared. I've done 3,000 flights and I've never been worried once. What is that like in anesthesiology world? Because people go in there super scared all the time. I'm sure sometimes there is troubles or whatever, but it's like very much behind the curtain, sort of Wizard of Oz type stuff that people would be really curious about. So how do you think about the actual fears that people might have?
I would say the majority of our patients have significant anxiety about the surgery. It's just a common fear. And most of it is the loss of control. The idea that someone else is putting you to sleep is very uncomfortable for most people. I have a little bit of anxiety thinking about that. I have not had a general anesthetic, meaning I haven't been put to sleep. I did when I was 8, but I haven't as an adult. And the thought of someone else taking control of me and putting me to sleep is not the best feeling, right? So I completely empathize with patients who feel the same way as me. We give a powerful anxiolytic called Versed, which is, it works on the same receptor in the brain, the GABA receptor, as alcohol. So for many people, they feel like they just had 4 shots of whiskey, basically, without the nausea and without some of the kind of nasty side effects. So it's really funny, actually, some of the things people say, while they're under the influence of these anxiolytics. Obviously, we don't talk about what they've said. We don't share any of that. That's, you're not allowed to. That would be a HIPAA. Do we have a HIPAA rule in Canada? Is it the same? The privacy rule?
I feel like it is the same acronym. Yeah. The fun thing about this show is it's global. So it could be Australia, or honestly, one of the main listeners is India. So
okay.
We can speak in general terms, I suppose.
That's so cool. Yeah. It's another topic entirely, but I'm so excited by the thought that 1.5 billion people are suddenly going to be on the internet, all speaking English, and they're all Indian. It's going to be a real game changer for how the world uses the internet. So that's really cool that you have some Indian fans. But so we use that same receptor for anesthesia, the propofol that we give, the milky white stuff. We call it milk of amnesia, that the majority of surgeries use to put people to sleep. That also works on the GABA receptor. The gases that we use to keep people asleep, same receptor. So it's this special part of the brain that triggers relaxation. And if you supercharge it with the medications we give, you go from relaxed to just asleep. So pharmaceutical coma, essentially. So one of the best ways, if I'm vibing with a patient well and they like my jokes, that's the best feeling in the world. If you can get a patient to laugh, that anxiety is gone. So I tell the worst jokes imaginable. One of my favorite things to do when we put a blood pressure cuff on someone, I have them raise their arm up. to put the cuff on. And I say, all right, do you swear to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth? And under the influence of Versed, it kills. That is always the best joke. So I I feel like if I could medicate people, I could be the best stand-up comedian on the planet. Like it's the best feeling, right? That, oh, my jokes are hilarious. So that I tell to people who aren't high in anesthesia and they're like, that's not that funny. And I'm shocked. Like, but my patients thought I was hilarious. Come on. So that's a big factor for it. As far as my own personal anxiety, routine surgeries, there's no anxiety. We always tell patients that the drive they took to get to the hospital was more dangerous than the anesthesia they're going to undergo, right? Sure, a couple times a year, some bad things happen. But generally speaking, your risk under anesthesia is very, very low, especially if you're healthy and under routine procedures. Now, that being said, when I've done trauma, so a level 1 trauma center in America, which is where I worked for my first 4 years, is where the worst of the worst happens. If you get shot, if as is the case of the story I'll tell in a minute, if you get in a really bad car accident and you happen to be 32 weeks pregnant and you need to have your leg fixed and also have an emergent cesarean section to remove the baby, that's a level 1 type trauma. So we had a lady, I think she was coming from Arkansas, and we were working in Missouri at the time. So she was being live flighted, probably 30-minute helicopter ride. So we had about 30 minutes of preparation to get ready for this huge surgery. Her leg was shattered from a terrible car accident. She was 32 weeks pregnant with an otherwise healthy baby. And so the plan was we put her to sleep, and the second she's asleep, we remove the baby as quickly as possible. So a cesarean section can be done in under a minute by a skilled surgeon if it's absolutely necessary to get that baby out as quickly as possible, which in this case it was. The mom was losing blood. The baby was not doing great. If we did not surgically remove the baby, it probably would have died within about an hour. So we were able to save the baby. There were 100 people in this room, right? So there's reps who have the equipment. There's nurses, there's surgical technologists. There's about 10 anesthesia providers, including me. We race the mom into the room, get her monitors on her, push medications to get her off to sleep. And they hand me the blade and the tube and say, put the tube in. And this is the easiest intubation I've ever done in my life. She's totally healthy. I see all the anatomy just how I want it. My hand is still shaking because I'm a little nervous. There's a whole room full of people. And this is a relatively complex procedure. Placing an airway tube is routine, but you never know. So in this case, I looked beautiful, no problems, put the tube in, everything went great. But I had so much adrenaline, for this process. And we took the baby out. The neonatal staff was there to take care of the baby. Brought the baby up to neonatal. We fixed the mom's leg. Took about 10 hours. And I woke her up and said, hey, congratulations. Your baby's healthy. She did great. Kind of a weird, experience, right? To wake up to a cast on your leg from it being broken and being told that you have a new baby. But she was appreciative. I got to go follow up and see her. Their family's beautiful. She's doing great. But that was a scenario where I will admit, I was nervous, as that was going on, just because there was so much happening in the room. And so we tried very hard, just as a pilot would, to have tunnel vision on just our area of expertise. When anesthesia is nervous, everyone's nervous, right? So it's our job to stay calm and make sure that we project an air of calm and strength. So never let them see you sweat, is kind of one of the maxims that we try to follow there. So if I am nervous, I try very hard not to project that. And then when the surgery's over and I'm in a safe place, I'll let the nerves out however I need to. So that's usually been my goal, and that's worked out pretty well.
The relative nature of the line of work that you're in makes it almost too easy to have perspective in life, in the sense of that's such a challenging, acutely stressful moment that's like very serious. Two people's lives at risk, and one of them's literally a baby. When you are out in life and maybe it's mostly a positive, but does that have an impact on your emotions at all in other aspects of your life, I guess is what I'm asking.
I would love to tell you that I compartmentalize perfectly and that I see these crazy things, right? I mean, I do see people who are dying. We do a lot of surgeries that are palliative, meaning it's mostly just for pain control, for people who are dying of cancer, all that kind of stuff. So from a perspective sense, if I have just spoken to a family of someone who just lost their grandmother and I'm a little bit hungry because I'm late for my lunch or I didn't get enough sleep, that's a wonderful thing from a perspective standpoint to say, wow, my life is not that bad. You know, I'm seeing people every day who are in a really tough position here. It would be really silly for me to complain that, you know, my lunch is a little bit stale when someone just lost their grandmother, right? So you're absolutely right. From a perspective sense, it's wonderful from that end. Now, that being said, when my son was born, it was a pretty traumatic birth. My wife had a placental abruption. The joke is that if you work in medicine, all the worst stuff happens to people in medicine, right? So this kind of not super unusual, but pretty difficult to deal with birthing scenario happens to us. And my wife lost about 3 liters of blood. And as you know, there's about 5 liters of blood in the entire body. So she lost a ton of blood. She was very pale. I was very nervous as that was happening. I've seen this happen hundreds of times, you know, where there is a lot of blood loss and where it's a tough scenario. My son came out purple and he didn't breathe for a couple of minutes. So I'm counting in the back of my head, okay, how long can this go before he starts running into potential risks, you know, like cerebral palsy, that kind of thing that happens from that lack of oxygen. So he finally cried, breathed. They were able to get some oxygen into him. Pinked up. His APGAR scores were fine, meaning he was crying and doing his thing. Everything was great. But was I emotionless and cold and, you know, not worried at all? Of course not. It was my son. It was my wife. I was terrified as it was happening. So from that sense, no matter how many times it happens, yes, it's good to have the experience, and I was able to draw on that. And there were some times we can talk about later where I'm happy that I had that medical experience because it allowed me to take better care of my son when he did have some challenges later on. But, you know, whenever it's your own child, it's never quite the same as if it's someone else's. You know, you still have that little bit of panic that happens where you say, that's my kid. This could be bad. But I did my best to stay out of it and let the experts, you know, who are currently handling it do it, because it's impossible to be objective when it's your own child. You should never put your own wife to sleep. You should never take out the appendix of your uncle. It's just not a good idea, right? There's another surgeon who's happy to do it. Let them take care of that, because that lack of objectivity can make you perform worse than you would otherwise.
It's so fascinating to be drawing some connections to the end of life industry, that the funeral background that I have, because in like the case of one of my both, but more so in one than the other's deaths, I did a lot of the work around going to get his body, for example, and stuff like that. That was pretty difficult. A lot of people said, you know, someone else will do it. And I was like, no, I'm going to do it. There's a complete different thing there in that the goal is not to save his life. So my metrics for success weren't as important. So it worked out for other reasons. But yeah, that growing up around the funeral industry, seeing a lot of suicide and homicide in the line of work I do, and a lot of psychosis that like came on suddenly, and different mental illness experiences of youth that I've worked with, has over the years sometimes made it hard for me to feel compassion and empathy for people, like, you know, at a restaurant because they're upset, like you said, that their food's taking too long, or even just like more serious things, like if my wife's having a bad day or one of my kids have had a pain in the ass moment with their teacher, to be able to put myself in a caring and compassionate role in those moments. Cause I'm like, dude, there's so many bigger problems out there. I've had to learn over the years to shift depending on who my audience is and what they need at that time, to not just be, it's almost like the toxic positivity is a term that people use, right? Like when I had so much perspective, I used to work with kids with multiple disabilities as well. And we would lose, at least one student would die every year. And those kids all grew up in hospital beds. That's all they ever knew was hospital beds and wheelchairs. They couldn't walk, they're tube fed. And I was changing their diapers, 5 times a day. And they're like 10, 11, 12, 13 years old. It's like all those experiences for me made me in kind of my civilian social life be like, guys, there's no problems, But then I think that has a negative impact too, because people in that part of your life just don't think you care, And so I've had to shift back a bit to also being able to help that person who's stressed because their order is taking a little bit of a long time at the restaurant. But it's certainly, the perspective piece helps me personally, and I try not to kind of project that perspective onto others. I don't know if that makes sense, but it's something that I've had to be able to compartmentalize a little bit in that way as well.
When someone has not had your experience, to them, maybe that's the worst thing that happened to them that day, right? So if the worst thing that happened to you was that you lost one of the kids, that's a horrible thing, right? But if the worst thing that happened to that person all month was that their food was cold, that feels like a tragedy to them, right? I think it's Mel Gibson. He's a comedian, or not Mel Brooks, made a joke. Comedy is when you fall down a manhole and die, and tragedy is when I stub my toe. You got to think. So for so many of us, all we understand is our own pain and our own experiences. So if I'm living a relatively comfortable life, these little things can feel kind of traumatic or like a tragedy to me, and we often over-pathologize them. So I would push back from what you said, and that actually, I think your perspective is very helpful. And I think that you're telling people who are not really experiencing trauma, they're having just a minor inconvenience, for you to tell them in a gentle and healthy way, hey, it's okay. This is not that big of a deal. You're going to be all right. If you can do that in a healthy way, that can actually improve their life quite a bit, because they might be able to recognize that their complaints over this minor thing are, maybe they shouldn't be complaining so much, right? Find a healthier way to look at that minor inconvenience. Yeah,
fair point. I think it's like you said earlier about finding the right times to be like George, where you're able to be a little more blunt and say it how it is instead of beating around the bush, mixed with, an example is like, someone will be like, my roommate from college who I haven't talked to in 25 years died yesterday. And I'm like, well, both my brothers who were my best friends have died in the last few years. I could say that. It'll be all right. My brother's died and I'm fine. But in that moment, it's important to just sort of help them grieve and take the steps that they need to take in the moment, I guess. And it's so contextual that, we could talk for hours about that idea of compassion and figuring out.
You never want to one-up someone's tragedy, right? You never want to one-up someone's tragedy. So if someone's having a bad I've made that mistake before. In an attempt to empathize, they'll say, oh, I just lost my, this thing. And I'll say, oh, I just lost
my guinea pig.
Yeah, they lost a guinea pig. Oh, I lost my grandmother last month. I feel your pain. That's awful. Well, now you're taking their pain and comparing grief. And that's a crazy thing, right? To be one-upping each other on the grief hierarchy. So you're absolutely right. That can go too far.
Yeah, and it used to, for me, it's an automatic kind of thing. I write about it. I spend about, probably up to 80 hours now working on this email course, for lack of a better term. I need to find a better term because it's not fair for what it is, but it's like 7 weeks of channeling your grief into some life writing that I've been putting together since October. But in there, I kind of speak to that change that I made, because it was kind of an automatic to sort of like, you one up, but it's not wanting up on purpose. It's kind of by accident that it happens, because it's an automatic kind of response.
Yeah.
And now I hear that and see that all the time. And I notice it right away. It might be two other people talking and I'm like, that sucks. You see the other person, like, it's like, I'd have to look up that meme too. My wife sent it to me before and she's like, this might be you. And it said something about like, you might be broken if you never get upset at anyone because you have too good of an understanding of psychology. I'm like that in the workplace a lot. I'm like, I can see what all of your brains are doing right now. It's almost like I can see the behind the scenes of what your brain's doing. And then and I'm like, that sucks. And then I'm like, but she didn't even notice that that's how she responded. Well.
Yeah, you could be like an emotional intelligence coach. That would be amazing. You could probably help people a lot, just go through and throughout the day and say, this is where you could have been kinder, or this is where you could have been more assertive, or this is where someone took advantage of you and you should have stood up for yourself. That would be like a really interesting thing to have like an AI coach in your ear, seeing what you're seeing and then say, okay, here's what you did. Here's what you should have done. Here's how you can improve. That would be like a fascinating, thing.
Two things come to mind there. One, the quicker one, is that I love the idea of learning from the industry of sport and how they do feedback and like film study. And like, I used to show a really good clip of PK Subban, defenseman of the Montreal Canadiens at the time in the playoffs, came off the ice after the first period. I would show this at leadership talks about feedback. he comes out off the first period, sits down. He's got only half his gear on. There's about 7 coaches there right away. They're showing the film. They're circling on the film, being like, this is where you messed up. This is where you fucked up. This is what you should have done better. Every single time he's like, yep, got it. And they're like, Kate, do you have any questions? And he's like, no. And in and out, and like an oil change or like a tire change in F1, like 5 minutes of very fast. Some people would see it as ruthless, but if you're an athlete by trade, it's just normal feedback. But it seems ruthless because it's to the point, it's timely, it's everything that you would want to hit on in terms of effective feedback, and it happens so fast. But what I point out to people in these leadership talks is not once, I guarantee if you ask him, not once did he take any of that personally. And not once was he feeling attacked. It was all for learning as a group, a common mission and a goal. And he's like, all right, I got it. Boom. And then he's right out in the next period trying to fix those things within a matter of minutes. And a lot of times in different industries, we'll kind of beat around the bush or, be like, okay, we need to review quarterly. And it's like that feedback loop is so slow and, people are taking it personally and that sort of thing. I mentioned there was 2 things. The second one was that I am really interested in how much or how little emotional intelligence is quickly learnable. And I don't know, that's like literally just a massive question as opposed to having any answers right now. But it's a fascinating topic because I feel like everything is learnable and teachable to a certain extent. When you start unpacking emotions and trying to help people with the intelligence around their emotions, there's a lot that comes up there. It's almost like you got to be part of a team because you need the therapist too. You need their best friend to have their shoulder to cry on, different elements of being able to help people with that. I've seen people try to work on it a lot. It's not easy.
One of my best friends is a therapist, and he always says nobody comes to him because they think badly. They come to him because they feel badly, right? You never go to a shrink because you're like, I'm not thinking well, right? It's always, I feel bad, right? And so he is really big on emotions and what he calls affect, which are kind of the building blocks of emotions. And so most of his patients, he would argue, lack some element of emotional intelligence. And so he's able to tap into where they lack that intelligence, and then he would argue much more quickly help them feel better, right? He's not necessarily teaching them how to think better, which is what a lot of psychotherapists try to do. He's teaching them to feel better. And so this will go back to my favorite book, His Needs, Her Needs, where he talks about everything's communication in therapy, right? If I can talk to my wife better, we're going to fix this. And he argues that's not the most important thing. It plays a role, but what he found was a lot of couples who went to therapy and they got really good at communicating exactly why they hated each other, and they still got divorced, right? So it didn't do any good. So his goal is to teach people to have positive emotions, to fall back in love, essentially, because them. There's all these old people, right, who've been married for 60 years. They're desperately in love. They wouldn't know what to do without each other. And they're terrible communicators, right? They can't even hear each other. They only understand half of what the other person says, but they still love each other. So I think we often over-focus on communication as an element of emotional intelligence when, in fact, what's more important is how you make people feel, right? So if you and I leave this conversation and we were very clear about exactly what the other person said, but we thought, Justin guy's an idiot, I don't like anything that he said, I don't feel good about the conversation with him, that wasn't a good conversation. Right. But if we're laughing and maybe we missed a couple things, I didn't understand what you said exactly, but we really liked each other and said, I could be friends with Justin. He's a cool guy. That's a much better experience. Right. So when it comes to emotional intelligence, I think the psychology industry has over-focused on communication when that's not what I would argue is the most important aspect of a relationship and the communication that occurs between each other is that perfect, crystal clear communication. So I grew up with Mr. Rogers. Are you familiar with the TV show?
Yeah.
That's where I learned emotional intelligence. What do you do with the mad you feel? Right. I would come home. I was super angry. I would talk to my mom a little bit. It would help a little bit. She was wonderful. My mom has incredibly high emotional intelligence, almost too much. She's so empathic that it drives her crazy sometimes because she understands how other people are feeling so well. But I would listen to Mr. Rogers, and he would, with his little puppets, right? I'm about 3 or 4 years old at the time. He would explain to them why they're feeling mad and that it's okay, and how to recover from that anger, and how to not slip into it and just have it be this constant, process. And then he would go into another scenario where two people, had these interpersonal challenges, and he would help the characters work through it. And it was magic. It taught me so much. And I don't think we have a new Mr. Rogers for the next generation. There's some of it, but kids programming seems to be more focused on entertainment and less focused on learning important things like how to handle your emotions in a healthy way. And so if we took half of public school curriculum and took it out, we gutted the biology and the physics and the chemistry and got rid of some of the math and the English and replaced it with emotional intelligence and some feedback where people talk to each other and learn how to be good friends and how to be kind to each other and how to stand up for yourself when you need to, I think people would be a lot happier, and I think they would learn more too, right? If you spend an hour doing that stuff, maybe you're more primed to go learn biology because you're not in a bad headspace. I know when I was depressed in high school and just could not get over the fact that a girl had just rejected me. I'm awesome. How could she say no to me to go out on a date? This is crazy, right? That's all I was thinking about. And so my teacher's talking about, the biology of the cell. And all I'm thinking about is the biology of my brain and how angry I am and sad I am. So if we focused more on that and helping kids deal with their emotions in healthy ways, I would imagine that would lend itself to better learning in the other areas as well. So that would be the biggest change I'd love to see in public school curriculum, is a bigger emphasis on emotional intelligence.
I've always said if we can teach how to learn, so the metacognition and thinking about thinking piece, which is arguably the most important thinking, to use too many thinkings in the same sentence, and how my brain works would be the two most important things. And then let's talk about what we should put on top of that, which is probably language, essentials, math, and you can kind of fill that in. But I think that should always come on top of a foundation. That's definitely something that's completely lacking. When you were talking about communication, there's so many domains, and I think that's, again, where things get contextual. It's almost like these podcast episodes are like super philosophical in the sense of we can talk about a whole bunch of ideas, and then eventually it always comes back to it depends. Because maybe some couple needs communication as their main thing to work on right now. And that's why one-to-one coaching, especially of athletes, but in any area, it could be life coaching or therapy, will never be beat by the 1-to-10 coaching, which, and then the courses for 1,000 people. Like it gets less specific the further you get away from being able to tailor and individualize things. For sure. One of the things that ties into literally all of this, and especially when you bring up Mr. Rogers, is the title of your show, Present Fathers, to kind of circle back on that open loop that we had about your podcast, but also related to what we were just talking about. What are the lessons that you hope, like the actual mission of the show? And when I hear the term Present Fathers, it makes me think a lot of these things that we are talking about. But what does that mean? Like, what do you hope, similar to how you said, if we change the curriculum, maybe youth will understand some different things? What are like the 101? We don't have that much time, but what are the things that you hope people get from your show?
I've gotten so much out of the guests that we've spoken to. I've spoken to some of the most intelligent, most honest, most interesting dads on the planet. And it's been magical for me. I know I've leveled up quite a bit from having these conversations with these men. So my hope is that one of my wife's favorite things to say is don't make the name of your show ironic. Right. So if I'm ignoring her and my son to, respond to a text, I'm not being present. I'm certainly guilty of that more often than I'd like to admit. And some of the strategies that I've learned for how to deal with that, I've learned from the dads that we've talked to. The most obvious one that's made the most sense to me is find a special drawer to put your phone in when you're with your wife and your children, because you have a potentially annoying 4-year-old and a wife who maybe you're arguing with versus all the knowledge that humanity has to offer in an algorithmic form available to you. What's going to win? Your phone is going to win, right? So you have to put it away, because the temptation to check those notifications to see what's going on is going to be too great. we're only men. We don't have infinite willpower. And so it has to go away. If your phone is on you, you're going to check it. You're going to look at notifications. And so put it away. Don't look at the phone. Look at your family, spend the time with them, be present. Right. So that's probably the most important thing that we can leave anyone with is your phone can really harm your relationship with your family in a lot of ways. It makes them feel like they're less interesting and less important than whatever's on your phone. I know I feel that way at night. If my wife is scrolling through reels on Facebook, instead of talking to me, why is your phone more interesting than me? I have so many interesting things to say. You should listen to my story, right? And I don't blame her. I get it. She's like, oh, yeah, whatever. I'm going to, but it really breaks that closeness. And it's amazing how just a couple of short distractions can ruin a special moment that you might be having with your children, right? You only get so many teachable moments where you get to really imprint your ideas and what it is that you are as a dad on your children. And you may miss that key moment because you checked a notification and you really needed to know that fantasy football score. And that's really a shame, and you won't know it. You'll think that it's just normal to have maybe a little bit of disconnection and, most people don't have that close of a relationship with their kids when they're older. So, no big deal. They live their life. I live my life. That's a little bit of a tragedy to me. If you as a dad don't have much of a relationship with your adult children, that's really a shame. That shouldn't happen. And that may offend some people, to say that people have their reasons for not having relationships with their parents. But if you have gone through and spent 18 years of your life raising your child and providing a roof over their head and giving them food and all of that, and they have no interest in spending time with you when you're older, something went wrong along that chain there. Something happened that broke that relationship. And who knows what the myriad of factors was, but it may have been something as simple as distraction and your lack of interest, right? The most important, loving thing that you can give to someone else is to show them your attention, right? Because there's so many interesting things. You could be listening to the Present Fathers podcast. That's pretty interesting, right? But instead I've chosen to save that for another time so that I can talk to you and spend this time building blocks with you and all that. And I have to continually remind myself how important that is to give my attention to my son, because he's not going to like me this much, for my entire life. He runs home into my arms, daddy, daddy. He's excited. He grabs me. He has so many things he wants to tell me about his trucks and his new friend. And I'm not always going to have that. And so I need to really soak that up and enjoy that. And yeah, maybe he farts in my face or, makes a mess or any of those kinds of things. And it's annoying at the time, but I wouldn't trade it for the world. And so my hope is that by being present, by showing attention and by showing a lot of love, I'll continue to have that great relationship with my son as he gets older, and that'll benefit both of us.
Unless you do a really good job of sharing content and stories that portray that you are a good dad, I think you are an incredible dad. And I think you, whether learned or come about it naturally, really do a solid job of that. So I say this with less advice and more, well, maybe advice for anybody listening, but less towards you. But you and I were both personal trainers, and that's something that we have in common, and we were both successful ones. This reminds me a bit of something that I used to talk with clients about, and I've had to remind myself over the years, but I'm also a little bit lucky that I learned it, but I also come about it a little bit naturally as well. And that's that I actually enjoy the pain a little bit of working out. I actually enjoy the process of tuning into my workouts. So I've seen David Goggins talk about how he and like Jesse Itzler and a friend of mine, Ray Zahab, like the super ultra marathon crazy runners purposefully don't bring headphones because they want to be able to be so tuned into their runs and not distracted during it. People are like, yo, you're psycho. I can only go for a walk or a run if I have my AirPods in. Luckily for me, that's how I kind of feel with workouts. It's like enjoying the fact that it's a little bit hard to push through this wall sit, or that like flipping this tire is a little bit difficult. Like there's something about that that brings me pain and joy somewhat simultaneously. I find that the presence piece is the same as well. Like I don't have to trick myself as much of with the drawer stuff or like things like that. And I'm super fortunate for whatever reason that was. And of course, I'm a slave to algorithms and these super powerful social media companies, like even something like Netflix. If Netflix wants to win, they're going to win. It's so powerful in terms of marketing and stuff to draw our attention. So, of course, I'm not like special or anything, but I find that giving people the advice who want to get better at working out, it's like actually enjoy the process of it as opposed to the what you see in the mirror or what you see on the scale. Like just start enjoying working out. That's going to be the real trick. And so for people who want to be more present, like enjoy being present. Like if that's the case, then you're less torn because you actually are enjoying it. But there's something there, having talked to a lot of people who are struggling with parenting, where of course on paper they know they should love their kids, they know they should love the time, but they do, like, I don't know if it's fear, I don't really know what it is, but there are people that struggle, they almost feel like anxious or something when they are present. I'm not sure if that's been your experience with people who have, reached out on the show or listeners, or if you kind of know if I'm just making shit up. But that's an interesting topic too, is if people could enjoy being present. I don't know what it is. They're like nervous parenting or something.
I think it's hard to be honest about it because it sounds terrible, but as men, especially, I didn't have my son until I was in my 30s. So I had my entire 20s to play video games, to play sports, to have all these other activities. When I had my son, I gave up playing tennis competitively. Now, every day that I was wiping my son's butt, would I have rather been playing tennis instead of wiping his butt? There were definitely times I would have rather been playing tennis. And I think we have to be honest about that and say, it's okay to admit that selfishly there are other things we'd probably rather be doing. And so there is some resentment that comes along with that change as we sacrifice activities we used to enjoy to then go spend time with our children, right? I play t-ball with my son every Saturday during games, right? Would I rather go be competitively playing tennis like I was when I was 20 versus watching him play t-ball? There are definitely times I'd rather be out playing tennis. And I think we have to admit to that and say that it's okay that we are selfish creatures. Because if we try to hide that, we're going to have that anxiety that you're talking about, right? Because I think if I'm dishonest about it and I feel guilty that I don't necessarily always want to be 100% present with my son, I'm going to it's a very uncomfortable feeling to have that guilt and that feeling that I shouldn't feel this way, right? That's a classic. I have that all the time. I shouldn't feel this way. Okay, maybe you shouldn't, but you do. So now you have to deal with it, right? And our kids go through the same thing, right? I see that with my son all the time. He has this anger. He doesn't know how to handle it. He says, and he'll be very honest about it. He's 4 years old. He says, I shouldn't feel this way. And I try to let him know it's okay. It's okay to feel a certain way as long as you don't, act on it in an unhealthy way. And so, as dads, we have to do the same thing. We have to recognize what our feelings are. And I think some of that anxiety that you're talking about for a lot of men, at least in my case, it would be, I feel guilty because I shouldn't feel this way. And so how do you handle that? You have to fill your cup up however you can, right? I don't get to play 30 hours a week of competitive tennis, but I go and play pickleball with my friends. And I get a little bit of pushback from my wife sometimes. Hey, I'd rather you come help with dinner and cook and all that. And I'll say, Kim, I love you, but I haven't done anything fun for myself in like 2 weeks. You got to let me, I got to have some time to myself to go remind myself that I'm still a man and not just a dad, and that I have these things for myself. And if you don't let me do that, I'm going to be miserable. I'm going to resent you. I'm not going to be present because I'm unhappy. But if I go and fill my cup up and I get some sleep, I have some sex every once in a while, and I go and play some sports, and, some of these basic needs that we have as men, I'm on fire. I'm so happy. I'm excited for my career. I'm excited to go see my son. And I know when I go through stages, which we all do, where I'm not having my needs met, I'm resentful. I'm crabby. I'm annoyed that my lunch took 10 extra minutes than it should have. Little things start to get to me. And then when I recognize that and say, oh, you know what, it's been a while since I've had this closeness with my wife. We haven't communicated. I haven't done some fun things recently. That's why I'm unhappy. Let's go get that taken care of. Go fill my own cup. And then I'm able to go help other people and be present. So at least in my personal experience, when I find myself unable to be present, it's usually because I don't want to be. Right. People don't want to exercise. They don't enjoy running. Well, they're not going to go run. Right. And if you don't want to go be present and be a good dad, you're not going to. Right. So you have to find ways to where you're not resentful of your children. And I think a lot of us as men, if we were honest with ourselves, have some small level of resentment towards our children because it changed the nature. Now our wife pays attention to our kid instead of us. And we don't get to work out for ourselves. We go watch their t-ball game. Right. That could be a situation where it could lead to some resentment. But if you flip that on its script and say, I get to go watch my son play t-ball and I get to watch him develop and I get to have these special moments with him and I get to have this amazing relationship with my son that nobody else gets to have, that's how you get over those feelings.
Yeah, as you're sharing about the t-ball and not tennis, that was kind of running through my mind, the idea that perhaps it's just about making sure that your needs are identified through some self-awareness. And then not just, I know my needs, but not going, 6 months without playing tennis. Cause then that it's just, then you're using your kid as an excuse, because there should be somewhere in the 6 months that we can figure out how to at least meet some of the needs, like you said, to the extent that we can in the moment. When I think about podcasting, which has come up, 3 times throughout the episode, your show, Present Fathers podcast, and how you got into that. And we also just talked a lot about careers and your time in medicine and how you shared that you wouldn't necessarily quit, but you'll find whatever that balance is between the two. It really makes me think of the fact that you became a content creator at all, because for some people, they want out of their current work, or they see the 9 to 5 as something that they like to go on social media and criticize. But the fact that you appreciate the work that you do and you are creating content is special. Why did you start wanting to use green screens and microphones and cameras as opposed to just, going to play tennis?
It's a huge creative outlet for me. When I was younger, I loved writing. I was on the high school newspaper, and going into medicine and doing personal training and all that, I got away from that. So it was probably 20 years of my life where I was not writing very much. I was not doing any of that kind of stuff. And I like to think that we reinvent ourselves every decade, right? So my 20s were all about fitness and health. My 30s were all about medicine and getting married and traveling and all that. And then my 40s have been about learning, having not had my dad around, learning how to be a dad when I didn't have a model for that, learning how to have the best relationship possible. And in doing so, sharing with other people and creating content around that has helped me get better. And it's really filled a void that I didn't realize that I had, which was this need to create and make beautiful things. And I have aphantasia, which is the inability to form images in my mind. So I can barely draw stick figures. If you tell me to visualize an apple and then rotate it, I can't do it. I don't have it. But I have a very strong verbal, I constantly have this very strong inner monologue going on. And so when AI came around with large language models and I can tell an image generator to make a thing that I tell it with words, it's magic. It's so cool. So one of my favorite things to do is to create different kinds of digital art with just words. It feels like this, like I can see again almost, right? Like I was blind and now I can see, I can create these images essentially. So that, the writing, all of this, I feel like I'm on fire with it. It's so much fun. I absolutely love. And communicating with other men like yourself who are brilliant and having these conversations feels great. So for me, it's not about getting away from work so much as it is finding a new element of myself. And I think my 40s are going to be a lot about that content creator arc. And then who knows what my 50s and 60s will be, but I hope that I see men who are high school heroes and they're 70 years old and they talk about that touchdown pass they threw when they were 16. And it's like, you really haven't done anything since then? Like you're going to lean on that, So resting on your laurels is such a shame. I spoke with a man recently who used the example of sharks that have to constantly keep swimming, right? Or great white sharks do, or they'll die. And I think men have a lot of the same. We have to constantly be swimming and moving, or we die spiritually, right? And so by constantly trying new things and challenging myself and moving in different directions, I am having so much fun, and I'm able to help other people in the process and be a better father to my son and be a better husband. And that's what that content creation is about the community, about the sharing, and about the creation all at the same time.
We have so much in common this way, because a few years back, I was watching the show on Netflix called Abstract, and each episode is about design thinking. It follows different people. One of the episodes, for example, is Tinker Hatfield, the shoe designer at Nike. And there's just incredible episodes with people who have made a career out of creativity and kind of going through their own creative process. And I remember at the time, this is when I was first dabbling with the idea of content creation, and I thought that I could, well, it was honestly a dream blocker. This is a topic for a whole other episode, but like my way of first getting into content creation was reaching out to brands, hoping that they would sponsor a show when I had -1 follower. Like I didn't even have an account yet. And I'm like, hey, I want to go make this show. Will you make it with me? But what I sent to the producers of a Netflix documentary was the idea that I wanted to create a documentary called Uncaging Creativity. And we would interview people who have recovered what they were like as a kindergartner, because all through my 30s, I didn't do anything. I mean, people would say that the way I was a personal trainer or the way I taught people maybe, or some coaching stuff was creative in the way I handled it. But to me, it wasn't creativity. I had put writing on the back burner. I had put filmmaking on the back burner. I had stopped drawing. Like I didn't feel like I was creative anymore. I didn't paint. And so I wanted to go create this whole, like, this is how you regain your creativity, first person kind of thing, which in small ways, we have these massive dreams, and then we start building them in smaller ways. That's what this show is for me. So I completely relate to that idea of wanting to go back to being that kid, you know, like the Peter Pan, don't grow up, it's a trap kind of concept, you know, being able to start having those creative outlets. And wherever they go is always awesome places. I mean, we're on this episode right now. And I know naturally we'll have to wrap soon. We could talk circles about all of these topics. I probably jotted down like 7 other things we could have talked about. That's just always the case with great conversations. But you mentioned very briefly there that who knows where the dream of it, or like the content creator arc, will be throughout your 40s and 50s. But if you were to dream a little bit, like what are some of the goals that you already have clarity over when it comes to being a content creator?
I have gotten a lot of traction with my writing. That's what's really resonated with a lot of people. And I think it's my most powerful skill that I have. I don't necessarily, if I had to choose the thing that I absolutely love the most, it might not be writing, but I've read from a lot of people that's an interesting perspective that pick what you're 1% at. This was Delian Asparuhoff. He started Varda Space. So they're shooting medications up into space on a SpaceX rocket, developing them with a drone up in zero gravity for like 10 minutes, bring it back down to Earth, finish the process. Talk about a creative guy. He literally created the space drug industry by himself, right? And so his argument was that you shouldn't go, quote unquote, do what you love. You should go figure out what you're top 1% at, right? What are you the best at? And for me, that's writing. I'm a very, very good writer. And then go get even better than that. Be top 1% of the 1%, right? And get after that. So video making, I'd like to think I'm top 10%. People probably think I'm top 20% at best, but whatever. But with my writing, I know that I'm a very, very good writer. And so that is the direction that I think is most likely, if it goes anywhere, to really do something. So if I take my top 1% and make a top 1% of that and keep iterating and improving on that, that would be really special. If I could think of myself as someone who's able to really clearly give people great ideas based upon my ability to write, and I'm able to do that as a 50-year-old, that would be really something. And that would be special. And it would give me an opportunity to make my little microcosm better. I'm a big believer that I'm probably not going to change the world, but I know that my little town in Florida, I can make it a better place. And that's a really empowering feeling to know that the, couple thousand people around me that I might be able to influence, I can have a really powerful effect on those people. And that's enough for me, knowing that I've made my local community, and now with the internet, my digital community as well. So you probably have access to 10,000 people, right, that have seen maybe more, maybe 1 million people, whatever it is. And they might be in India, they might be in France, wherever it is, but that's your little digital microcosm of those people. And so your 10,000 people, you can affect them with your videos and with your work that you do. And I can affect my 10,000 people with my writing, right? And so that's it's a little bit limited, but I like limits. The idea of, I'm going to change the world and be president and change everything. It's too much, right? It's depressing because then you're never going to reach that. But if you say, okay, here's my goal and it has specific measurable ideas and limits and I can hit that, that's an incredible feeling.
I went through some very intensive therapy, 14 years old to maybe 16 or 17 years old, that I argue saved my life. And just this past year, I had some pretty tough times in October 2023 throughout the last winter. And at the recommendation of my doctor, plus just knowing that therapy is not a bad idea for anybody, it was like, yeah, no, it's time that you go back. And not to open up too big of a story arc here, but I was given a referral to a place. I called the place. I sent in the application that you have to fill in to become a client. And then I get this call back and it says, Dr. Blouin would like to schedule an initial meeting with you. I was like, the fuck? And I look, sure enough, that was the therapist that I had almost 30 years ago. And I had gone this almost 30-year gap of not having any therapists. He was just starting when I had him work with me the first time. Now he's towards the end of his career, is nearing retirement, but he owns this whole practice with 15 therapists underneath him. He hardly even takes one-to-one clients anymore. And because of the history, he said, yeah, I'll take him back as a client. And so since January of this year, so it's going on 4 or 5 months now, he said to me, look, of course, when you're acutely struggling, we're going to talk about what's going on, but I want to get the whiteboard markers out and I want to take you through my whole cognitive behavioral therapy process, like how I teach it to all the people who come into our practice, because I want you to understand and really learn the overall foundations to what you're learning. And I promise not to open up too big of a story when it comes to that, but for me, it kind of ties these things together, learning the kind of what underlies these things as opposed to the little kind of topics that we can learn from, but when it comes to being able to teach those lessons, and the reason that I brought him up was because he created a book. And now a lot of the things that I'm learning, I want to package into Twitter threads or share it with my newsletter. You share being the top 1% and focusing on that because that's writing for you. But quickly, I'm curious, is that you want to make books yourself? How do you share that knowledge? Is it Twitter threads? What does writing mean? Because it's such a broad term.
I don't know how interested I am in putting a book together. I think, writing the great American novel, writing some fiction would be really fun, but it's not at the top of my list of things that I want to do. The ideas that resonate with me the most are short and packaged better so that they can be absorbed in 5 to 10 minutes. And eventually bringing all of those together into one, book of ideas could be interesting. But as far as the writing that I think I'm the best at, that I enjoy doing the most, and that has the potential to be the most impactful, it's shorter pieces. So that could be blog posts. Maybe I start my own. Tim Urban is a personal hero for me. Wait, but why? Incredible human being. His writing really resonates, and most of it can be maybe 20 minutes of reading, but none of it's in large book form. So if you were to give me a hero that I would want to be like, as far as someone who's able to get people to think differently, really have an impact, it would be a Tim Urban type of guy who has an incredible blog and then does other material as well. So he does a lot of super short form. He does some medium form and some longer form blogs. So that would be what I would see as the model.
It's awesome. The other connection that I was making to Dr. Blouin is that when you mentioned the 10,000 people that you can impact, one of the acute things that he did have to work with me on was like one of my big whys that can wake me up at night, or like Elon Musk says, figure out that problem that you can't sleep because you want to continue to work on it, and then you're going to know what to work on for the rest of your life, is something that we kind of talked a little bit about earlier, is the idea of shifting education and changing how youth learn about things like content creation or emotional intelligence and entrepreneurship, and the things that maybe aren't taught well in school, so that we can help them live a better life, so they can live the awesome life that we're living, but figure out how to pursue their passions at least a little bit, manage their emotions, manage their time, manage their projects, and just live their best life. And he was like, he just said so bluntly to me once, he was like, you can't. He's like, believe me. He's like, 20 years ago, I would have loved to change medicine, change psychiatry. And I had to come to terms with the fact that I can't, but I can bite off these little corners of that massive problem, and realistically I can solve them. And that was a moment I remember both of us just sitting in silence for like a full minute, and then me being like, okay, I get it. And I think we know that realistically you can't make every father present. We know that. But when we start out on these content creation missions, we feel like that is kind of like the goal, shoot for the moon, land amongst the stars, but at least keep the moon in the window. And when it comes to having that mission, but being okay that we can still go to bed at night and stuff like that. Like I used to literally pull all-nighters to edit episodes or these sorts of things. And it was easy because I'd be like, no, I'm saving the world. Yeah. And now I need to be like, okay, chill. I'm going to get as far as I get with this goal, but I'm going to be healthy while I do it. And, there's lots of things we've talked about. I like to do rapid fire questions towards the end. There's things we've left out. Like I had jotted down talking about modern philosophers, the life skills that we learn from a podcast like yours, or the conversation of dads when they're not around. Like how do we, kind of learn some things if they're not, because some families just don't have present fathers. Yeah, I mean, enough for 10 more episodes.
Well, have me back. I'd love to chat some more.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I really do look forward to it. It excites me to have repeat guests for sure. I know everyone's time's valuable too, so I really appreciate you taking the time to do this episode. I do have a couple other things, like I said, some rapid fire questions and a couple things that I would like to just ask before we wrap. But before I do, I always want to make sure that I don't forget to ask on these topics or other ones, is there anything that we'd be leaving out if you weren't to touch on it quickly?
No, let's go to your questions. I think we've hit it.
They're a little more rapid fire in nature because they just didn't make sense during the conversation, but they also go back to some of those threads that we kind of touched on. And one is, when it comes to podcasting or content creation, what is something that you would do differently now that you've maybe learned the hard way, but you would change about how you got into podcasting and content creation?
Oh, good one.
While you think, I can phrase it another way. I appreciate silence. This is a good lesson for interviewers. Silence is important. I used to cut that out. There's one. That's what I would change. I used to cut out silences and now I leave them.
Yeah.
While you do, I could just maybe phrase it in another way, that if somebody else is listening to this, they're going to go start a podcast.
Yeah.
What is something that you think they could learn from you instead of having to learn that lesson the hard way?
Don't worry about how many subscribers or followers or listeners you have initially, because getting a following quickly is more of a curse than a blessing. because you won't be ready for it and you won't be good enough yet. So we've had slow, steady growth over the past couple of years, and that's been wonderful because none of us had the speaking skills. None of us had the editing skills. If for some reason we'd been picked up as this big sensation suddenly, we would not have been ready for it and we would not have deserved the audience that we had built. So as we build slowly, we continue to improve our skills. And if we ever do have a larger audience, we will deserve that audience. We've spoken with multiple larger content creators who have said, you guys seem like you are like bigger podcasters. The quality is there. The content is there. We could definitely see you having a larger audience. And that would not have happened if it had been the reverse. We got a big audience. We weren't ready. And so be happy when it takes longer than you think to build an audience.
And maybe if it wasn't a slow, patient process for you, you would have had some of that boy band inner fighting that we were talking about earlier.
That's a great point. Maybe we would have, like broke it up and been like, no, you're the worst. And then it wouldn't have even worked. That's a great point. Yeah. Yeah.
One Direction style.
Yeah.
When we're talking about anesthesiology, I was anesthetized earlier this year, and I remember the girl coming up and she was like over my shoulder and she was like, "You ready for me to put you to sleep?" And when you were talking about the joking thing, that made me think of that because I laughed and I was like, "I don't know yet. Are you good at this?" or something to that effect. But one of the things I wanted to ask, where it was like this moment where I was like, I bet you people are wondering that I didn't really have a chance to ask you was, are there levels to being anesthetized in the sense of like, for some people, a certain situation is more dangerous, like they're more asleep or more closer to death versus like being less likely, like whereby that girl, maybe she was super confident because that's like a drug that's not that deep of sleep, or is there levels to being put to sleep?
There are, yeah. If you're getting a routine colonoscopy, which you're getting up there at 45, you're supposed to get one. So
that's what it was.
Yeah, it was colonoscopy. Yep. So you were asleep, but you weren't. There wasn't a ventilator breathing for you. You didn't have gases on board. So if for some reason during that colonoscopy you had briefly woken up, that would not have been the end of the world. Some people, that happens to them. We try to make sure people are asleep the whole time, but if someone has trouble breathing or there's some unsafe thing going on, we'll usually wake them up to the point that they might have some memory of what's happening. And it's a procedure. It's not a surgery. So it's not the end of the world if someone has a little bit of recollection from that. Whereas with a major surgery, like if we were taking out your appendix, that would be really problematic if you're awake during that experience. So yeah, sometimes we do something called conscious sedation where you might even remember some of it, but you're relaxed with medications. With the colonoscopy, you're probably asleep, but you might not be 100% of the time. And then big organ removal surgery, you're definitely asleep the whole time. So yeah, there's MAC, which is monitored anesthesia care, versus general anesthesia where you're totally out. I even had a nurse, she broke her arm and we did a local anesthetic where her arm was totally numb. And she said, I don't want any sedation. So we talked about her grandkids for 2 hours. She was totally awake during the entire procedure. The drape was up and, we got to chat. So that's even one level of anesthesia you might see. So there definitely are different levels.
Now, I know a lot of people choose that because of their fear with respect to addiction sometimes.
So if someone is addicted to heroin, for example, we do, if they request it, we'll try to avoid giving them fentanyl, for example, because they're both are narcotic opiates. But if I were to give them propofol, that works on a totally different receptor, and that should not lead to them relapsing potentially. So having anesthesia is not necessarily a bad thing for someone who is addicted to heroin or to cocaine. But if someone has an addiction to ketamine, we're seeing that more and more, we probably wouldn't necessarily want to give them ketamine for the surgery because that could trigger, some sort of relapse. So we do our best. There are so many different kinds of drugs. And if you are addicted to one kind of drug, you won't necessarily have problems by being given a one-time dose of a different kind of drug, if that makes sense. So it really depends on the patient. But yeah, we've had lots of patients who are chronically dependent upon opiate narcotics. Maybe they had back pain from a surgery and they're just, constantly using it. And so we do our best not to use too much of that. It might be an indication for that kind of situation.
I've seen you post about this before, that some of those chemicals are the same ones that people are using on a Friday night to feel a bit of a buzz.
Yeah.
And when people see you post that, I'm sure, like, how do you feel about alcohol as like a social thing in general? Like, do you, and respect to kind of more connecting it to being a present father and sort of like the life advice for people, like using alcohol, nothing to do with the anesthetic piece, but like using alcohol, like what is your stance on that kind of as a father, I guess? And like,
I think it's a season of life. So in your 20s, you're in college, having a few drinks, I think is fine. 30s, same thing. If it's affecting your life to where you're sleeping poorly, to where you're not being present, to where you'd rather be drinking than spending quality time with your kids, then you definitely should stop. I think for most people that's a pretty reasonable time to look at stopping. Interestingly, people who wake up angry from anesthesia, swinging, that kind of thing, are often people who would be called maybe a mean drunk. Right. So that's a good indication when someone tells me, I ask, do you drink? They say, yeah, but when I try not to too much because when I get drunk, I'm really a jerk. I know they're going to wake up swinging on me. Like that's just because it's the same, kind of thing. But as far as alcohol for me, as I've gotten older, I've gotten away from it as much as I can. When I see people come in with hip fractures, who are 80 years old, that kind of thing, it's often alcohol related. So what happens is, as we get older, our tolerance for using these kind of medications drops significantly, right? So 1 or 2 beers might be enough to put an otherwise healthy 80-year-old in a very unsafe state to where they might smash into the car in front of them when they're driving. Whereas a 20-year-old who has a beer, I would never recommend anyone have a beer and then go drive a car, but I would be much happier with a 20-year-old having 1 beer than an 80-year-old having 1 beer and getting in that same car, right? Because their faculties are just different. So the way anesthesia affects older people is different, and the way alcohol affects older people is different. So my personal goal, and take this, with a grain of salt as a guy, whoever you are, I definitely enjoyed alcohol when I was younger. I still do as a 40-year-old man. I don't have an unhealthy relationship with it, though. I'm perfectly happy having 1 beer and saying that's enough. Whereas I have friends, if they have a beer, they want 10 beers and they need to keep going. That person maybe should consider not having any alcohol. As I get older, though, I notice that my sleep is not as good when I drink. And then I'm cranky the next day. I don't want to exercise. I'm in a bad mood. Not worth it, right? So from that perspective, I am limiting myself on alcohol more and more. And it wouldn't surprise me at all when I'm 60 if I've had my last drink. I would not be sad if I, on my 60th birthday, say, okay, that's it. I'm done drinking. I have a special bed called an 8 Sleep that has thousands of sensors on it. And it has snoring detection. It has all these cool, but it's really cool. So when I have a couple of drinks, every time the next day I wake up and it says, did you have alcohol last night? Your sleep was terrible. And even a couple beers is enough to trigger that. So that is I love data. The more data I have, the better, because it tells me, okay, how my health is, how my behavior is, all that. And so the more data that I have that indicates that I'm less sharp, I'm less happy, I'm less strong, all these things when I drink, that is a strong indicator to me that it should be a rare experience with friends, maybe once a month. And then if I find that I'm drinking regularly once or twice a week, I'm not as happy. And so I've tried to back away from that.
Yeah. And I was a bit curious about that because a lot of people throw around ideas on social media about you should drink, you shouldn't drink. There's so many different kind of like opinions and debates and controversy around that. So I was interested in someone who has shared the fact that it works on the same parts of the brain as someone who is being anesthetized and who has that more medical data-driven background, like how you felt about it. So I think that's really interesting. So the pure rapid fires that everyone get, though, is just one thing that you are learning right now.
I just finished reading The Founders, which is about the founding of PayPal. So Elon Musk, David Sachs, all that kind of stuff. And I had no idea, when you get the thing where they deposit like 10 cents and 20 cents in your bank account to verify that it's you.
Yeah.
PayPal invented that. And then CAPTCHA. Okay. Show all the bikes, show all the cars, all that. That was also a PayPal invention. So all these brilliant people got together, worked 100 hours a week, no work-life balance. They were all crazy, went public, all became millionaires. And now the PayPal mafia is what it's called. YouTube, Tesla, all these different companies were invented by the PayPal mafia. And
that's
so
fascinating.
Really yeah.
There's been a ton in this episode, and there'll be many more if people tune into your show. But one piece of advice for the next generation, if you could only leave that one piece of advice, what would it be?
Focus on great friendships and be a great friend. Men especially are more and more isolated. And if that is you, I meet so many older people, and the ones that have friends and family that they stay with are so happy, 80, 90, 100 years old, doesn't matter. They're thriving. The ones that don't have friends and don't have good relationships are not happy and aren't doing well. So life is all about friends and families. So cherish your friendships, be a good friend, and keep those old friendships. There's nothing like a friend you've had since you were a kid.
Couldn't agree more. One question for me. So we're to flip the mic, and I know you're a podcaster anyway, so it'll come a lot more naturally. But if you were to ask me a question on these or otherwise, these topics or otherwise, what would be a question that would come to mind?
Tell me a little bit more about the book that you're working on and where I can read it. Do you have any pieces that are out yet that are for public consumption, or is it all purely not ready yet?
It's awesome to think of such a big answer for like a short question and then try and like wrap it up. But when you asked that, I was trying to think of like how much I've shared about this book already that you would know about. And I don't even know, because sometimes I just like share things to socials and not even like pay attention to what I'm saying. But so where the book, my goal is to release the book in October 24th, 2024. So this year, which is fast. Like even Ryan Holiday, when he talks about his first couple books, they took like over a year to put together. So I'm a little bit nervous about that part. But the thing is, I've been creating individual chapters through voice notes while I'm driving or while I'm walking for years. And so it's pretty much all on the same table of contents and then split up into chapters as is. I was just speaking with John Meese yesterday of Sell Your Smarts Online, who has the book Always Be Teaching, I believe his book is called. And so mine will be of the brand name like this, Just Keep Learning.
Yeah, nice.
Yeah, it's going to work out well. And what I was telling him was that I see youth all the time with self-help books. It's funny. I don't think people would think that teenagers would walk around with like a lot of the books that adorn my shelves, but they do. They love them. So like Glennon Doyle's Untamed is a really popular one. Cleo Wade's Heart Talk, Mark Manson's Subtle Art of Not Giving a Fuck, Rachel Hollis, Wash Your Face, Girl Wash Your Face, like stuff like that. These kids are consuming right now, but the book itself is, I don't want to say they're boring, but a lot of the topics they have to gloss over. So they take out like the self-helpedness, the personal development of them, but they can't really connect to the stories as much, or the stories are a bit longer. And so the vibe that I'm going for is personal development, classic book, could be for anyone to help them in life, more likely to be entertaining for a teenager. So kind of the Austin Kleon doodles. When John Meese wrote his book, Always Be Teaching, he used a lot of doodles and kind of like simple drawings and stuff. A lot of room to breathe. The other one that I like to compare it to is Humble the Poet, was also a high school teacher. He became a very popular author as well. And his first book was called Unlearn 101 Life Lessons, I think. And they were almost like shorter than a page, like each of the 101 topics, very short with a lot of room to breathe. And so that's the goal of the book. The table of contents essentially is the hero's journey, because as opposed to a random 101, I've kind of put them a little bit in order if you were to go on your own hero's journey. And hopefully I'll just share a ton more on social media and through email and be able to talk about it that way in terms of how you can read it or send you a copy or something. I'm excited about that. One of the things that I'm toying with is how to do the behind the scenes part while it's like how to build in public with it. Because the odd tweet here or there, or the odd Instagram story, I don't think it does justice. I want to do something a little more engaging and helpful for people, whether they're just interested in the writing or wanting to write their own book, or they're even just thinking about their own book and they want to see the process. Because for me, it helped a lot to read Ryan Holiday's post, like how I wrote my book and how you can too. It was cool, but it always comes after, right? So trying to capture it in the moment a little bit is something I'm trying to figure out right now without it wasting time, because you can't take away too much time from writing. So we'll see. I might just go live while I'm writing a little bit sometimes.
That's a good idea. I like that.
Yeah, I think, and here's the thing. It's a great lesson for other people in the social media world. Maybe 2 people tune in and then 1 logs off. And then 20 minutes later, 3 people hop in. I don't know. We'll see. But I'm trying to think of sort of how to do that. And then, does the writing exist at all? I've had to slow down my podcast production specifically for that. And I know I talked earlier about seasons, and this is one of those things where it's really, really hard for me because I want to just record an episode and publish it to kind of keep the content creation of the podcast flywheel going. But then if I haven't written yet today as the habit, I can't do that, because it's like I'll just end up all of a sudden going to my editor and being like, yeah, it's not done yet. And I don't want to do that. So I had to put the book as the priority. All this to say, every time I'm done a chapter, that's the episode that I'm going to create. So I'll essentially read the chapter because they're very much aligned. Like, all of my solo episodes have always been like this bite-sized topic, why we can learn from Ed Sheeran, like why he sucked at singing and why success is just about math. That's my most listened to podcast episode ever. Like, that's an example that's already written. That could be a chapter in this book. And so I'm going through the lens of finish chapter 1, post that as a podcast episode. Finish chapter 2, post that as a podcast episode. And if it takes me 5 days to do that, or 2 weeks, great. But that'll be the process from now until this book is done.
And as of yesterday, if you take a link to your podcast episode, stick it into Google Gemini and say, transcribe the episode and tell me all the relevant points about it, it'll spit out a really good analysis of everything that happened on your podcast. Then you can use that for your writing. So kind of interesting.
That is interesting. So you can take a URL, like let's say one of the Present Fathers podcast episodes. You just take the link and that's it.
That's all you need. Yep. It blew my mind. It's check it out. I don't know if you can do that with ChatGPT or any of the other ones, but as of yesterday, they did this big announcement and I tried it with a couple episodes and it got the key points pretty good. And it did it in like 5 seconds. It blew my mind. So if you want to mine all of your old episodes and go, okay, tell me the key points. How can I, and you could even say what would be interesting from this for a book. If I'd say this would be a cool book chapter, it's really interesting stuff.
Yeah. It's fascinating, all that, to be able to use those. I really appreciate that. That will be helpful regardless. And when I mentioned John Meese and comparing it to his book, the other reason I said that was because something we were talking about was the fact that this book isn't really designed to be like lead generation to like a business funnel, or it's, it could easily, it's not niche in the sense of like how to podcast, or the way that I would tell a lot of people from a business standpoint to create their first book. Mine's a lot more like, this could be bestseller, like Mark Manson style, do 20 million. It's probably not going to be, but I wanted to make sure that the first book I wrote was just purely as good of a book as I could write, that people actually enjoy writing it, not writing it because I hope that they'll click on something or, like this, that the book itself will make people at business conferences want to book me or something like that. All of that I don't care about right now. So what's cool, and why I say that, is that looking at all these past episodes or anything I've shared, like nothing's off limits to what could be in the book. So that will be helpful, because I think I'm not worried about hopping around topics. It just needs to be who I was listening to I can't remember what the episode was, but it was a YouTuber talking about Billy Joel, Piano Man, and how Billy Joel put out like 6 albums without like seeing big success. And part of the reason why people think that those albums weren't successful was because of how much effort he went to make sure that every single track was good. And then a funny phenomenon that happened was there was no 1 or 2 singles that people could single out to hit like mainstream radio. So until he started having big hits on like album 7, and then people went back to review the catalog, then his early music didn't get popular. But he said that I'm not changing. Like, I need to make sure I only put the album out when every song is good. And that's kind of how I feel about the chapters in this book too.
That makes sense. I like it. Well, I need to go pick up my son.
Me too.
Yeah.
Daughters though.
Yeah, exactly. But this has been an absolute blast. Thank you so much for having me on the show.
Absolutely. Appreciate it so much. And if people go to check out your work online and support you, where should they go?
So I'm Dustin the Dad on X. That's where I'm most active. And then we are the Present Fathers podcast on anywhere you get podcasts, Spotify, Apple, YouTube, all of those.
Awesome. Appreciate you. We'll do it again sometime. Go be a very present father, as will I. And we'll talk soon.
You got a deal. Thanks again, Justin.
Thank you.